be here with you all today. Sorry I can't be with you in person. It'd be great to be back home, particularly as it's my birthday. So yeah, I'm going to wish myself happy birthday today. So
happy birthday to you.
So today I'm going to be looking at shifting sands, and particularly what are the abiotic factors. So what are those physical factors that are driving coastal dune mobility? So this is a highly mobile dune that you can see here at Morphydufferin, and it's an example of the very mobile dunes that we have here on in the UK. So what is coastal dune mobility? When we think about sand dune mobility, what we're really talking about is the bare sand. So that is predominantly associated with erosional hollows such as this, which is a sand dune blowout. So it's parabolic dunes, sand dune blowouts, and they create that unvegetated sand surface, which is interchanged between dune mobility and bare sand. And that is caused both as sediment is eroded, so it can be an erosive surface, or it can be a depositionary surface as sediment is eroded and then deposited in lee of the dune. And this sand dune mobility presents both problems and opportunities. So where at Inch, for example, if you've got lots of mobile sand coming in on shore, as you can see here, it causes very little problem. It's not much infrastructure. There's not much golf course behind it or anything like that. But if you go to somewhere like the Maharees Peninsula, you'll find that that mobile sand is causing really quite consequential problems. So there's an example, winter of 2015, 2016, that the only road in and out of the peninsula was blocked on 17 occasions. And you can imagine if you need to get an ambulance or the guards up there or anything particular, that's going to cause a real problem. And you can listen all about that from Eugene on YouTube, which Alex. So yeah, about that. Somebody's got a microphone on, sorry, or yeah, there we go. And also then, so those are some of the problems that we have, where we have that mobile sand that comes in on shore and causes problems with infrastructure. It also has lots of opportunities for biodiversity, in particular our plants and our animals. So if we look at an example here of Morphydufferin in the north of Wales, is a really good example of how sand dunes are a mosaic of habitats. So we have our bare sand here, we have short grass, we have some shrubs, and then we have these ephemeral ponds known as dune slacks. And they provide this mosaic of habitats for a range of plants and animals. So we have in particular 400 vascular plants here in the UK, in particular sea holly that we're looking at there, 680 nationally rare invertebrates such as miner bees. So if you're ever in these sand dunes, if you ever look at the erosional walls, you might see lots of little holes. That's where our solitary bees are mining and are living. Then you can see natterjack toad amphibians as well. I know they're on the Maharees Peninsula as well. And then we'll see sand lizards present in these environments, and they need those areas of bare sand as well as the vegetation to exist and live. However, our coastal dunes are changing, as we've already talked about this morning from both of our presentations. Our coastal dunes are highly dynamic. And in this regard, I'm talking about a different aspect, and that is how the vegetation has changed. So here we have Portchurch Strand on the north coast, and we can see these lots of patches of bare sand in the sand dunes here. If we fast forward 30 years in the Google imagery, we can see that most of this bare sand has decreased entirely, and we can see just these small patches that are left from those relatively large blowouts. And this isn't just a local problem, this isn't just isolated to one beach. Derek and Andrew in 2011 looked at this at 10 sites in Ireland, and they found an average decrease between 1985 and 2005 of up to 80% decrease in bare sand. And again, looking at Portchurch Strand, this is the beach here we have along the front in all these images. The bare sand is delineated by the orange in this case, and we can see a dramatic reduction year on year or decade on decade in bare sand. And again, between 1983 and 2004, we have approximately a 70% reduction, which is very, very similar to that 1985 to 2005 reduction of 80%. So this is a consistent picture that's been happening throughout the island. If we go across the UK, Ken Pye et al., they looked at a similar case in Wales, a slightly longer period in this one. They looked from 1945 to 2009 approximately, but a very similar percentage. They found an average decrease in this bare sand or the sand dune mobility of 81%. And again, a very similar image to what Derek and them showed. You can see in this case that we have the bare sand is red. So this is Aberfrow on the island of Anglesey. This is the beach here at the front, and we can see all that bare sand in red. Fast forward to 2009, the only bare sand remaining is that associated with those erosional walls of the parabolic dunes that still remain. So we have very little bare sand in place. And Derek and Andrew changed this not only from a regional picture or a national picture, but they scaled this up to a global picture as well. And they found a very, very similar story that was told at Port Stewart, throughout Ireland and throughout the UK as well. So whether you're right up here in the north of Europe or down in South America, we have a very, very similar picture throughout the globe, where as you progress from 1980s onwards, the amount of vegetation steadily increases. There are a few exceptions, but generally, as time has moved on from the 1950s to the present day across the world, these coastal sand dunes have got greener and greener. However, there are some exceptions, and it's these exceptions, however, some people have become quite worried about this, particularly Ken Pai et al. In 2014. They wrote that several rare species and plants and vertebrates have declined dramatically because of this homogenization of vegetation. So you're losing that mosaic of habitats, you're losing those bare sands, those sand dune slacks, which your amphibians live in. And as a result, across the world, from New Zealand right up to Denmark, but particularly here in the UK, we've had a dynamic dunescapes project in the last few years that has been removing some of that topsoil and vegetation to try and increase the dynamism of these dunes. And a similar project, the Sands of Life, has been looking at 10 examples in Wales and doing very similar things, trying to restore those areas of bare sand, trying to increase bare sand in these locations. And that is predominantly from a biodiversity point of view to try and halt or reverse some of that decline in rare plants and animals. However, from my point of view as a researcher, it is these exceptions in this otherwise vegetated landscape that has really come to my attention. So this is Ainsdale National Nature Reserve. It's a large sand dune site just north of Liverpool. And within this otherwise vegetated landscape, we have these three relatively large and growing sand dune blowouts. So we have a bowl blowout here, we have a smaller saucer blowout, and then we've got a V-shaped trough blowout here. And this is a landscape that, as I said, is pretty much homogeneously vegetated around it. But within this landscape that's predominantly vegetated, we have these blowouts that exist. And my question was, why do we have these blowouts naturally existing? And is there any environmental drivers at a landscape scale that we can isolate and understand that maybe are encouraging this bare sand to continue in an otherwise vegetated landscape in a global picture? So where does bare sand still exist, and why does it exist there? So what factors did we investigate? Well, first thing we did was to measure the bare sand, and we used that using a semi-classification method in GIS. And again, quite like Dylan's article before, presentation before, we validated that, and hopefully you can read all about that. Will be coming out in review quite shortly. So first thing was to measure that bare sand, and we classified that using 25 centimeter imagery. The second factor that we thought might be causing this bare sand at a landscape level was slope. So we're very lucky here in the UK to have a lot of LiDAR data and several years of it as well. So we used 1 meter LiDAR data for that. We looked at aspect as well, so whether a slope was facing to the north or the south. And again, we looked at that using 1 meter LiDAR data, and that's not being presented today just for simplicity. And finally, we also thought, what are the other drivers, abiotic drivers of bare sand in these locations? And we thought it could be wind speed as well. And we were able to calculate that using a numerical method called computational fluid dynamics. So at a landscape scale, we calculated that wind speed just above the surface of the dunes. And we've done this across 4 sites in the UK, and that's to try and capture a variety of situations and environments. So we've got Ainsdale Dunes in the northwest, Aberfrow on the island of Anglesey, Morpherdufferin in North Wales, and then Penhale in Cornwall. However, today's presentation is just going to cover the 2 of those first 2, Ainsdale and Aberfrow in Wales, which we've already visited today. So just a brief history, a potted history of Ainsdale sand dunes, so you can understand the site and the dynamics that have been there. It's predominantly managed as a national nature reserve, Natural England, approximately up to around there. That's what they manage. It's a relatively large site. And this site was almost entirely covered with pines up until the 1990s. So all of this region here was Corsican pine, Pinus nigra, and that was removed in the 1990s, and the area has been subsequently grazed by sheep and cattle since. Predominantly in the winter, they bring down sheep from the Lake District, but cattle are also present on the site as well. Surprisingly, considering it's so close to Liverpool and it's a relatively popular coastline, there's relatively little footfall beyond the fore dune. So a lot of people are walking up and down the beach, but not many people go into the dune. There isn't a local car park. It's quite inaccessible, so there's relatively little footfall. So there's not much anthropogenic influence beyond the fore dune itself. However, there are some active blowouts. You can see them here. and there is some bare sand associated with some relict parabolic dunes, and we can also see some blowouts at the front there as well. So some discrete patches of bare sand do remain on those stoss slopes and several predominantly vegetated parabolic dunes. So my question was, where is the bare sand on this site, and what are the landscape scale factors that are driving it? And so we looked at that in turn. So first of all was to map that bare sand, and as we can see, mostly it's situated on the foredune, some of it associated with some discrete blowouts and a relict parabolic dune as well. Well, then we calculated the wind speed. Red represents high wind speeds, blue low, and this is a westerly wind, southwesterly wind coming in. We can see topographic acceleration over the foredune, and then we can see some acceleration as well over some topographic highs. And we can see in those hollows and those steep slopes that we have relatively low wind speed on average in those areas. We also looked at the slope, and again, dark green is very steep areas, white is the flatter regions. We can see it's a very scarped foredune, so very steep foredune. Then once we go over the foredune, it's relatively flat, and then we get some steep local slopes associated with these parabolic dunes and blowouts within the hinterdunes. So qualitatively, when we kind of look at that, we can kind of eyeball, we see, is there some correlation between the slope and the bare sand and wind speed? And it's very, very hard to tell. There does seem to be some similarity. However, to statistically test that, we use some Spearman's rank correlation between the two. And we did this at 4 different scales. So we looked at the whole site, we looked just at the hinterdunes, which is kind of like this region here. We then only looked at the foredune region, and then we just looked at a single landform, which was this parabolic. And in all cases, it's a weak correlation or a very weak correlation. But what is of substantial note is that in each case, slope is the better predictor. So slope is a much better predictor of where bare sand is at this location rather than wind speed. At the whole site, it's still a very weak prediction. That decreases for the hinterdunes, and it's very, very weak for the foredunes. So we see a very weak correlation for both wind speed and slope there. And intuitively, that makes some sense as well from what we heard from Eduardo and Dylan before as well. So at this location, we've got the biggest biotic influence. We've got people trampling through it. We've got some vehicles as well moving through this region. And also we've got the impact of those large waves and extended flooded periods as well, which aren't captured by any of our forcings. At a landform scale, so just looking at our parabolic dune, we have a relatively high correlation compared to others, so it's still a weak correlation. But at this local landscape scale, we do see that those steeper slopes are associated more strongly with bare sand, and wind speed does a better job compared to the rest of the site as well. So that is Ainsdale, some correlation, best with slope, pretty poor for wind, but overall it's a pretty weak correlation between those areas of bare sand and the abiotic factors that we examined. At Aberfrau, it's quite a similar story. It's not a national nature reserve in this case, but it is a special area of conservation. And again, bare sand is mostly only associated with those relict erosional landforms that used to be there. It's a common land, so it's extensively grazed year round. There was a brief break, I think, between 2000 and 2006, but this land, as far as I'm aware, has been grazed quite extensively since then. And again, quite like Ainsdale dunes, the visitor pressure is largely restricted to access paths in the foredune. So we see people enter from the village here, they walk along the river and onto the beach. There isn't actually that much access paths and anthropogenic activity in the sand dunes themselves. Aberfrau, when we did that measuring of the sand dunes, so when we classified it, again, very similar story. Mostly that bare sand is at the foredune and again on the erosional walls of the parabolic dune. Wind speed is a much clearer story here. So we can see as wind flows across from the beach, topographic acceleration on the foredune. We then have an area of separated and reduced wind speed in lee of the foredune, and then we see some topographic acceleration along the ridge of those parabolic dunes before these areas of slower wind flow in lee of the landforms themselves. Slope, again, very steeply scarped foredune, very steep slope, is approximately 70 degrees in places here. And then we see a steep slope along that topographic crest as well, or along the crest of our relict parabolic dunes. So again, qualitatively, we can look at it. There does seem to be a better, stronger correlation here. Bare sand does seem to be associated quite well, in particular with the slope and the wind speed again. However, statistically, we're only showing moderate relationships again in each factor. And again, just like we saw at Ainsdale, it is slope that is by far the better predictor. In this case, we've got moderate correlations for the whole site, the hinterdunes and the foredune. And again, When we look at that floor dune, it is the weakest. And again, we think that's because of the increased biotic factors and the influence of waves at this site as well. However, at a landform scale, so just looking at those parabolic dunes and looking at the entire site, we do get a moderate correlation between slope and bare sand at these sites. Wind, again, is relatively weak throughout. So wind does not predict, or doesn't seem to be associated or predict very well those areas of bare sand. And when we think about this, we kind of ground truth this against some of the data that we've been collecting over the last few years. Take you back up to the north of England, the Ainsdale here. This is a blowout in the sand dunes. And at this site, this is a photo taken just a couple of weeks ago. And we haven't had much wind until the last couple of weeks at this site. And this site has basically started vegetating in the last few months. And again, it's the shallow slope that we see most of the vegetation happening. And on that steeper slope, even though we haven't had very much wind, we still have had some scouring as we've got topographic accelerations of winds at this site. And then we also have slumping as this sand frequently dries out and then becomes beyond the angle of repose. And so we get lots of slumping and other activities, as well as during quite significant rainfalls. You also get some gullying at this site as well, where you get steep slope and the rainfall running down it. So in summary, what have we learnt about what drives coastal dune mobility? Well, where is it happening? Well, it's mostly at the fore dune and on those relic landforms that are otherwise vegetated. So although the deflation basin itself is quite often vegetated, where we have that relatively steep slope on the erosional walls, there is still some sand dune mobility happening. Why is it happening there? Well, at all scales, whether we look at a landform scale or at the entire site itself, it does seem to be most strongly associated with slope rather than wind speed itself. And as I said, that's because those steep slopes are probably subject to the strongest winds. They are also rainwater runoff, and we have those mass movement processes of slumping as well, particularly in the very hot, dry periods during the summer that we've had in the last few years. It's most difficult to predict bare sand or find an association with bare sand at the fore dune. And again, as we said, that's because of the waves that are at that site. And then we also have the effect of people at those locations as well. Last but not least, what are the implications for dune management at these sites? Well, if we're on the Maoris Peninsula, for example, and we want to try and stop some of that mobile sand encroaching and maybe coming over the top of buildings or roads, then maybe we can make those slopes more shallow, or we concentrate on fixing those steepest slopes. So that's where we prioritize our planting, or you can do some regrading to try and make that slope more gentle and try and fix that. It may increase the likelihood that that sand dune will come fixed and vegetated in place. And a contrast, if you're part of the Dynamic Dunescapes project, for example, or you're a land manager who wants to increase the amount of bare sand on your site, then maybe you can encourage dune mobility by only concentrating your vegetation removal on the steepest slopes to try and maintain the sustainability of bare sand on those locations. So instead of taking vegetation from an entire area, or if you've only got limited resources, concentrate on doing it on those steepest slopes, as they seem to be the most sustainable at continuing the presence of bare sand at these locations. So thank you very much.